Well, welcome everyone. We're excited to have our third conversation on grace. Such an interesting topic that we have this afternoon. And we're going to go right ahead and jump in with your amazing and challenging questions that we got from our ladies' tea this past summer. So Kevin, go ahead and get us started.
Sure. So this first one says, I wish I have found a definition with a simple explanation. It says, what one word is the same as grace? It's likely that you haven't found a simple explanation because there is no other word like grace. Grace sums up a lot of the spiritual themes involved in living a life of faith. But there's a few words I think added together can come fill out that our understanding of the word of grace. And the first word that comes to mind is mercy. The grace or the mercy that we receive from God. Another word is forgiveness, the forgiveness that we receive from others who we've hurt, the forgiveness we receive from God. Pardon is another more legal word, but also fits within this idea of grace. But what grace does, the word grace does very well, I think the other words don't do, is describe a lifestyle. Whereas forgiveness is something you can do once or do multiple times, grace is something by which you live. In other words, you have a grace-filled life. You can be graceful. And I think the way that grace helps us to articulate the life of faith is by its recognition that it comes through God's power. That grace is something that we do only through His provision of it. Whereas we can forgive somebody without God's help, we can't offer grace to somebody without having received that grace ourselves from outside of ourselves. Perhaps that's true of forgiveness too, but I could imagine a situation in which you forgive somebody and don't think of God. But I think grace is something that you offer to somebody, or the way that you live that requires God's presence, God's provision in order to live it out. What do you think? Is there another word?
Well, it reminds me of our last word, joy, in that it's a choice.
Right.
So it also is a way to live, and it's a choice. It's about allowing ourselves to be the channel or the vehicle of God's grace.
Right.
So it has to pass through us.
Sure.
We have to receive it before we can pass it on to others.
Right. Yeah, and I think to play off of that, the idea of like receiving, we know that grace is a gift. Scripture supports this. And so if this gift is given to us, it's a gift that we have for ourselves, that we have to receive for ourselves, but it's also a gift that we then extend to others around us. But we have to be intentional about knowing that grace, accepting that grace for ourselves first before we can extend it. Good.
And that leads you to the second question.
Sure.
Leads right into it, as you talked about it being something we do.
Yeah. So this question says, what does grace look like in everyday life? You know, I think it's unique to the person, but I think the common thread of grace in everyday life, as it exists in those people who are grace-filled, is, if I were to boil it down to one thing, it's making hard things look easy. When we talk about like a ballet dancer who's very graceful, doing complicated routines, but landing soft on his feet, there's a grace in it. There's a simplicity to the complexity and the moves that they're making. And I think to connect this then to a spiritual life, somebody who is facing great difficulty, great opposition, and making those difficulties look easy in a simple way, but more complex than that, not just simple, but looking as if they have power beyond themselves, and because they do. So I think that's the common thread of people who are grace-filled. They have this authenticity, they have this natural ability to move through pain and difficulty, this way with being with people that comes easy. Interacting with them is easy. Thinking of people in my life who I know are like this. Kathy, you are the first person that comes to mind for me, going through such great adversity, such great difficulty, but doing it with such seemingly ease. If you stop a person who is grace-filled and ask them about what they're going through in their life, I'm sure they can list for you all of the things that aren't going well, all of the things that don't feel quite easy, and yet their life and their relationships feel so natural and so easy. So that's a grace-filled person.
Thanks, Kevin. We hadn't planned on him using me as an example.
No, that wasn't.
But if I am considered a graceful person, from my perspective, what does it look like in everyday life? It is relying on a higher grace to get through the day. We recently, because we're here in Southern California, had the opportunity to open our home to one of our friends who has recently lost her husband and then was on the verge on Friday morning of losing her home. And because of the fires right. In her area. And she is a woman of grace. And what I learned from her through this story was that she was able to step into the grace because of her faith. And it's a mindset, and then it's also a way of life. And then when we were able to be in touch with her, she could tell that we were extending another arm of grace, and she was able to embrace the grace. And it's a theme that you're going to hear me saying later on today, that it's an action and a choice. And those of us who are considered grace-filled, it's because we're constantly having to choose it over and over. We're not filled up with our grace and then we are just a graceful person. It is a spirit-filled the spirit is what empowers the grace, I would say. So there has to be dependence and surrender. If you want to have a grace-filled life, you be prepared to surrender a lot of control and be doing things not the way you would like them to be done.
People who are grace-filled aren't rigid. They're not controlling.
No, they embody a lot of fluidity and a lot of openness to circumstances, to whatever God's plans are. And the word again is surrender. We have to surrender to the grace. So that's good. So going along with that, my questions also deal with grace. So what you're going to see this afternoon is there's a relationship between, there's one definition or definitions of grace, but then there's how it is that we choose to have a relationship with grace, which I think are two different things. So there's grace itself and then our choice to be in relationship. So here are the questions we got from our ladies. The first one is, do you have to behave in a certain way to maintain it? Do you have to behave in a certain way to maintain grace? Sort of just answered that. It's a posture of surrender. It's a posture of understanding that our life is not our own. Our circumstances aren't. When I woke up Friday morning, we had no idea that there were fires that had burned overnight to the point of evacuations. And grace allowed us to be in touch, opening ourselves up to an unexpected day, moment by moment, allowed us to extend grace. First be filled with grace towards those in need, and then to extend an arm of grace. So do you have to behave in a certain way? You have to be open, willing, listening, I think, is huge.
Yeah, the only other part that I would add to this, the question sort of alludes to this idea of maintaining active grace, the grace that Kathy is describing, like this everyday graceful moving about the difficulties that you face, but also this like theological grace, the grace that we're given to God. I think once we receive the gift of salvation, the gift of God's grace to us, there's nothing that we can do to lose that faith, to lose that grace that we've been given. But because it's like a gift, a present that sits in our bodies and our hearts and our minds, we can still maintain it, but not rely on it. And so I think there's a difference between maintaining, like we still have the gift, and relying on it, this dependence, the surrender that you're alluding to. So if you receive that gift from God, God has bestowed or has offered that grace, and we receive it, we accept the grace. We can't do anything to lose it, but we can do a lot to live life without relying on it. We can do a lot to live a life that doesn't reflect the grace that we've been given ourselves.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And we'd like to welcome PJ. Hi, PJ. We're so happy to have you. You're our first guest this afternoon. And if you have a question, go ahead and type it in the comment box, and we're happy to try to answer it on this question of grace this afternoon. So the second question related to this is why do some people have a hard time seeing grace? Very related to our discussion so far. Why do some people have a hard time seeing grace? So the shortest answer to that is that they have failed to see God's grace for themselves personally. So in some facet of their life, they have been injured. There's been a violation of trust. There's been some sort of disconnection, trauma. All of us experience all of this, but people who have a really hard time have had probably a lot of things happen to injure their sense of who God is in their life. And when you have a difficulty seeing God's grace, there's something that I always do for my life, and I recommend to other people, and it's also another G word, and it's gratitude. So if you're having a hard time seeing God's grace right now in your life, first of all, our hearts go out to you. We always have a hard time. Just because we're talking on it doesn't mean that we have a complete understanding of what God's grace looks like. Like we said, we can know it in our heads, but then to receive it in our hearts is different. So if you're having a hard time, when I take a second to write down at least 3 things that I'm grateful for right now, right at this moment. 3 different things, 3 new things, maybe 3 things that have happened just since I woke up this morning that I can be thankful for. And when we look at gratitude, when we allow gratitude and thanksgiving to change our perspective on how we're feeling or thinking or doing, then grace, there becomes a pathway for grace. And question, I wanted you to answer this question because Kevin works on the front lines of people with trauma as a hospital chaplain who see like the most difficult of circumstances. And how do you answer? Why do some people have a hard time seeing grace? Because you've seen people in desperate at their very worst.
The reason why we struggle, even those of us that are the most faithful, have strong spiritual lives, the reason why it's difficult to see grace at times is because it sometimes doesn't feel like it's enough. If I were to describe grace in 2 words, it would be God's presence. And God's presence with us does not prevent us from facing the most difficult of times. In fact, God's presence and God's promise to us, as Jesus said, in this world you will have trouble. But he goes on to say, but take heart, I have overcome the world. And so the reason why it feels like grace is not enough is because God's presence with us moves us through the difficulty of our lives, and it doesn't prevent us from it. And then I think back to your point is that we often don't feel worthy. We don't feel worthy of God's grace. And so we resort to very stringent and strict living. We turn to legalism. We turn to things that we can do to fix the situation that we're in, rather than being present with the pain, being present with the loss, the difficulty, and with God's presence with us in those moments. And so I think gratitude is a practice to help gain new perspective, and to see God's presence, and then to then feel and receive and accept God's grace in our lives. That is usually and probably not going to fix the problem itself, but be sufficient to move through the pain and the difficulty itself, so that we might be transformed through it. That's the redeeming God that we serve, that we face difficult things, and when we give it back to him, he can bring good from it.
So gratitude then is a reminder of God's presence with us.
To be able to, it's
just pointing out, practically speaking.
It's the pause in our day to
Right.
stop and to notice God's presence, God's provision, and his protection in our lives.
I see.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah.
And the other thing I would say is why people have a hard time seeing grace is what you just said, because we're not stopping. So if you're having trouble seeing God's grace, one tip is gratitude. Another one is you probably are afraid to stop. You don't want to pause because it's the opportunity for your life and the truth of your life to catch up to you, which is a quote from Brene Brown. But it is the way that then we allow God's presence, if that's also what we're talking about, to enter in to the moments and the spaces where we're afraid or heartbroken or in pain or in struggle, that we allow him to be with us, Emmanuel with us, is by the stopping and the pausing.
Right. So
I hope those are helpful ways that today, you can, even by stopping to listen to this broadcast or watching it, if you're watching it later on, is a way that you're allowing God's presence to be closer to you in your life. So that leads us to some excellent, interesting definitions that you all had. Kevin, could you read some of your definitions of grace?
Sure. You can help me with the handwriting too if I need it. So grace is what God gives me that I'll never find anywhere else. Something that I can't earn nor deserve. Right on. No edits to this whatsoever. It is a gift from God. It is not something that we can earn or achieve. It's something that we are given. Only interaction we have with God's grace is the opening of our hearts and our arms to receive it. We don't get God's grace because we earned it. Yeah.
And then mine's is similar. It says it's a gift given to us by Jesus that we didn't deserve.
Right.
Again, nothing we can do to earn it or work for it or buy it, which is why worthiness is connected to this a lot, and why people have trouble accepting it. But if you understand that it's a gift, then typically we don't work for gifts, I don't think.
And it sounds like a really easy thing, but if you're like many people I know, where you have a hard time accepting gifts or receiving compliments, it's the same thing. It's what we were saying earlier about this surrender, this openness, this willingness to take help, this willingness to receive something that you don't deserve. I think with it too, there's a recognition of a need. And if you think that you don't need anything, if you think that you're fine, then you don't need God's grace.
That's good.
Yeah. And then, so this next definition, grace cost me nothing to receive, and Jesus, the life he sacrificed for me, I only need to believe, right? And this word, I only need to believe, this word of this active receiving, trusting in the provision, trusting in the promise and the extension of that gift of grace. Absolutely.
Great. And this is almost a testimony definition, which we wanted to read, and from one of our ladies. God gave me grace, and I feel it all the time. It is getting stronger and stronger as I stay righteous for God. God took away my addiction, made me more giving, and made me forgiving of others, and a better person than I was, and the grace keeps growing and growing. I love that she said that the grace is growing in her, and she sees the progress and the process of grace. So grace is not a one-time gift. It's the process of us becoming more and more like God. It's the process, it's the actual working out of our salvation, of sanctification, of us becoming more and more like Him. The irony is, to become more and more like Him, we have to surrender to His grace to become more like Him, and keep doing that again and again to keep receiving more, to become more.
Right. Not just that salvation.
Not just one time.
Not just the first time. But all of the little graces that led to a salvational transformation, and then all of the little graces that lead to a life transformed. That's a lifelong accepting and receiving God's grace more and more, opening our hearts up to it.
So as we conclude this afternoon, we have a couple final thoughts on grace for you. I think a summary would be, again, reiterating. One is that there's this idea and concept of grace, which in all its complexity, we definitely couldn't cover it in half an hour.
No.
But we hope that we've scratched the surface of this amazing concept, which is the bedrock of our faith and of our relationship with God, is this idea of grace. So obviously we couldn't. But then the second thing is, once there's this idea, there's our relationship to it and our choice to be in relationship to grace and to choose it every single day. So final thoughts for me. One of my favorite quotes is by one of the writers that I love. Kevin loves her as well, Anne Lamott. She says, "I do not understand the mystery of grace, only that it meets us where we are, but does not leave us where it found us." I do not understand the mystery of grace, only that it meets us where we are, but does not leave us where it found us. And so the three lessons I learned from this quote is, one is that grace finds us. If you're looking for it, it's going to find you. You just have to be open to it finding you. Grace will find you. Two, once it finds you, you need to receive it. I call that embracing the grace. Oftentimes in our busy times and days, this happens to me often, where I have schedule after schedule, appointment after appointment, back to back, even thinking there's no way I can accomplish all this. And then somebody calls me, I get an email saying, "Sorry, I can't meet you today." I've learned in those moments not to fill it up, but to understand that that looks like grace to me for whatever reason, and to step into that grace if it means, okay, now I'm going to take a break instead of ignore that grace that just came today. God knew what I needed. Grace is God's idea of knowing what we need, but we have to stop and receive that. And then the third point is, we can be changed by His grace in order to be able to extend it first to ourselves and then to others. We have to become the channel. So if you want to be a graceful person, then you have to accept the grace first. The amount of grace that you bestow on others is in direct proportion to the grace that you've allowed God to give to you. And so I'm going to end with this verse from Hebrews 4:16, the NLT. "So let us come boldly to the throne of our gracious God. There we will receive His mercy, and we will find grace to help us when we need it the most." So may you boldly approach the throne of grace this week, today, and be filled up by his grace. Kevin?
The closing thoughts I have comes from 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 8. This is Paul talking here. He says, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. And Paul goes on to say, therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. I know there are many of you listening today who are hurting, who are in pain, who are moving through a loss, grieving a person or a relationship. What I know for sure is that God's presence is always with us. His promise is to never leave us nor forsake us. But what I know confidently on top of that is God's presence is with those who are suffering and in pain in a way that it is with nobody else. We see this the way that Jesus walked this earth, reaching out to and spending time with those who are suffering and in pain. And so if you find yourself today in pain, hurting, let God's grace be the balm for those pains, for that loss. And because my belief that God's presence is the manifestation of the grace he extends to us, it may not be the solution to the problem, but it'll be the provision to help you move through it. And so my hope for you in God's grace being with you is that it's something that you don't just accept once for salvational purposes, but you accept it continually to receive his power in your weaknesses. And my prayer for you is that when you do face difficulty, because God promises that you will, that God's grace will be with you and will stay with you because that's his promise, but that you will open your heart to it so that you might have great power beyond yourself to move through it with grace because of his grace.
Thanks, Kevin.
Yeah.
And we pray this was a blessing of grace to you watching today. And we invite those of you who are local to join us for our final gathering of the year, Sunday, November 3rd. We will have stories of faith, and we have a wonderful afternoon planned for you. And we hope to see you all then. If not, then we will have one more broadcast this year on faith. Will be our next topic, likely before the holidays.
Yes.
And until then, we pray that you'll embrace the grace in your life and reach out to us, Facebook, Instagram, text, email, cell. We're here for you to help you
move
through the grace, have more grace on your journey. So thanks for joining us, everyone. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.